We continue in Genesis 41 today as the beginning of a long relationship which will take up the entire rest of the book of Genesis starts here as Pharaoh and Joseph meet each other. And as they do, we'll see there's no introduction. Hi, I'm Pharaoh. Nice to meet you, Joseph. Pharaoh's right to business because as far as we can tell, this dream has been bothering Pharaoh for a long time. And now Joseph finally has his chance to speak to the person who's in charge of all of Egypt to see whether he can get permanently out of prison. So as we've been going over for this section, you can see on the right side of the screen our chapter 41 is the last part of this triptych, holding these three chapters together all around the location that begins in the custody of the officer of the guard, and we've been looking at that throughout. And it also begins to point the other direction, the series of binary encounters that began there with Pharaoh, and now it's Joseph and Pharaoh, as you can see on the left side. And then we'll see these alternating, the green ones with Jacob and his brothers, the blue ones with neither Joseph or Jacob in that immediate situation, and then the purple ones with Joseph and his brothers, and they alternate there. And throughout we'll see that to the brothers, Joseph is simply the man. So as we look at our key words in our section here, we're actually back up here in this part here where Pharaoh tells the dream to Joseph, and next time we'll see Joseph tells the dream to Pharaoh. And there really are not any new key words here. These words are things we've seen in the narrator's presentation of the dream in the first 8 verses, and of course the Vahana and Behold throughout here that are always covered up by the New RSV. The issue so much isn't key words here, or even the rare words that we've been seeing throughout that we noted last video are not in this immediate section. The last new rare word was in verse 8, magicians, and the next one will be really at the end of our section. We'll see it today, withered, but not very many, because much of what Pharaoh is doing here for Joseph's sake is narrating what the narrator told us in the first 8 verses. And as I was noting last time, when the cupbearer remembered his sins, the narrator told us then that Pharaoh told the dream to them, but it wasn't actually narrated in the text. So there's actually 3 versions of the dream, 2 narrated in the text, one of which only we hear, which is the one in Pharaoh's head that comes through the narrator's voice, and one which only they hear, which is Pharaoh narrating it in the presence of the cupbearer and the others. And we don't know if the others are here or not. It's simply Pharaoh and Joseph as far as we can see in that structure of binary encounters we've been just noted. And also I'd like to highlight, because it'll come up as you can see on the left side in verse 16, where Joseph will say to Pharaoh, "It is not I, God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer," or in my translation, more directly here, God's answer to Pharaoh is shalom. Either way, this and the dream in Daniel 2 are the only dreams in the entire Bible, the Hebrew Bible or New Testament, where there's a requirement by somebody in the dream, or somebody in the story rather, for an external interpretation, whether that's the magicians and other expert people in either empire, either in the Egyptian or the Babylonian Empire, or it's God. All the other dreams are interpreted directly. So what I'm suggesting here against interpreters who take Joseph at his word that Joseph is the theological interpreter of the scene and this is all God's doing, even though the narrator does not say so. The narrator said that Yahweh was with Joseph when he was suffering, but now that Joseph's about to be the second most powerful person in all Egypt, Yahweh is not mentioned by anybody, not by the narrator, not by Joseph, not by anybody. It's Elohim here, which is a fairly generic word for God and certainly not a God specifically recognized among the pantheon of Egypt. So for whom is Elohim important, it's hard to know, probably more for the readers than for Joseph. But in either case, I'd like to suggest that Joseph is using God, as people often use God, to give himself authority so that his dream will be understood as authoritative for Pharaoh. And although it will actually interpret what's going on, and then Joseph will go on to give Pharaoh agricultural economic advice, I'm asking you as a listener or anybody else who's listening to this dream across times, is it not fairly obvious what the dreams are about? Maybe not explicitly as Joseph interprets it, but you can decide that as we go. So looking at the Joseph and Daniel dreams, and as my list here has a whole series of parallels, but as I noted a couple of videos ago, Matthew Ringe over at my former sister school over at Gonzaga, sister Jesuit school at Seattle U, where I'm now retired from, highlighted not only these parallels, but some of the differences of how Daniel is a rewriting of Joseph to make Daniel look better than Joseph looks. And one of those key points is that Joseph does not actually go to God to get an interpretation. He simply puts God's name on top of his own interpretation. But in the Daniel story, there was an an interlude that we can see here where Daniel went to God to get an interpretation, and then that's what we're told in what's parallel in the last scene, that the royal officials found among the exiles from Judah a man who can tell the king the interpretation. Then the king asks him that, and then he says it's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And in fact, that's what we saw as readers happened in Daniel 2, that God revealed the mystery, and Daniel simply reporting what we had saw was given to him as a divine interpretation. But we don't see that in our immediate story. I also want to bring up, since there are no key words that we need to pay attention to on the left side that aren't words we've looked at before, this comparison of the narrator's version in the first 8 verses and what we see in Pharaoh's dream report here. And that won't take us very long to go through because, as I was noting, that we don't have to look at the key words. Let's look more at the drama of it as we enter into the scene that is laid out here in the green on the right side. So jumping in the left side, just to note again the lack of transition here. So if we go back just a verse before, we saw that Joseph had come out of the pit, had shaved himself, his head, and changed his clothes, and immediately, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, he doesn't even ask to identify him, he's brought in, and Pharaoh just assumes he's the guy. I have had a dream. Literally, I've dreamed a dream, as we've seen throughout, that it's not just a singular experience there. And there's no one who can interpret it. I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph doesn't say yes. He simply says, it's not I. And so as we look at that, we can see here on the left side what we can't see here on the right side, because this doesn't start until Pharaoh's recitation. God's answer to Pharaoh is shalom here. It's not that it's a generic favorable answer. The answer is shalom. As Westerman notes, even though I have to interpret tidings of misfortune to you, what God has to say to you will ultimately result in prosperity. But as I note further down below, how can Joseph presume to know in advance what God will do and what the dreams mean? As far as you know, Joseph has not heard the dream yet. And that's why Pharaoh narrates it here starting in verse 17. So Joseph's taking quite a risk there to say the answer is going to be shalom. But that, of course, I shouldn't say of course necessarily, it's one of the reasons why I think, and a number of scholars think, that the magicians and others in Pharaoh's court, it's not that they were unable to interpret the dream, it's that perhaps they saw all too clearly what the dream was, but they didn't have the agricultural economic response that Joseph's going to come up with. They simply didn't want to tell Pharaoh, there's going to be 7 years of famine and it's going to be hell around here, although probably wouldn't use the word hell. We don't know what it was that got the baker to have his head taken off, but certainly these people around are aware of how Pharaoh has the power of life and death and don't want to do anything to make it suspect that it would come down on them. So they demur, but Joseph has nothing to lose, and so that's what we hear. So let's look on the right side and see how Pharaoh in many ways replicates what the narrator's voice was, which is highlighting the narrator was giving us what Pharaoh saw. We couldn't have known in the first 8 verses whether the narrator is giving us what we might call an objective version of a dream, if there is such a thing. But now we can hear that the words Pharaoh uses are almost precisely the words that the narrator uses. And all I have in bold here are the things that are unique to each side. So Pharaoh starts off to Joseph, in my dream, behold, I was standing on the lip of the Nile, as opposed to what we saw in the original, Pharaoh standing on the Nile. Even though translators don't render it that way because it seems absurd, it's no more absurd that Pharaoh is standing on the Nile than that cows come out of the river. So he was standing on the Nile, but now a little more modestly says he's standing on the lip of the Nile. Is that to make it sound not as arrogant? Or maybe he doesn't just quite remember? If he's had the dream over and over again and it's the same every time, you'd think he would remember that he was floating over the Nile as its master. But here he is on the sideline. And behold, 7 cows, fat of flesh and beautiful looking, using the identical language of the narrator, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. And although he uses the verb for fed and it's grazed here, it's basically the same. And behold, 7 other cows came up after them. And here he engages in a little editorial commentary. Poor and very evil looking. Notice this is in contrast to the traditional translation as ugly, but it is evil description. And as you can see from art like this, it can look awfully evil. And thin. Never had I seen such ugly ones in all the land of Egypt. So focusing on that, or perhaps one could have said evil looking there as well. The thin and evil cows ate up the first 7 fat cows, and notice he adds first here. It didn't have first in the narrator's version. And he also adds this, and when they'd eaten them, no one would have known that they had done so, for they were still as ugly as before, or perhaps as evil looking as before there. I didn't translate that completely consistently each time. And so they're still as evil looking, like they're ravenous for more. In other words, whatever the 7 cows represent, there's no presence of them there. It's not like the thin ones or the evil looking ones are now fattened up. There's just simply nothing. Then I awoke, paralleling exactly what we heard the first time. And then I fell asleep a second time. Notice almost identical to the narrator there, in a way that isn't realistic in real life. It's as if he's being programmed by the narrator to say this here, but this is how it's written. I fell asleep a second time, and I saw in my dream, adding that there, behold, 7 ears of grain, full and good, came up on one stalk, exactly as the first time, and behold, 7 ears of grain withered. So he adds withered there. We didn't see that. We heard blighted in the first occasion. Withered, thin, and blighted. So withered and blighted, and sprouting rather than sprouted. So in the dream, it's continuing to the bad grain here is continuing to sprout after the good grain. And the thin ears of grain swallowed up the 7 good ears of grain. Good as opposed to plump and full. I'm not sure there's any particular meaning to that, other than that perhaps he's trying to get to the end of this and he doesn't need to say that again. But when I told it to the magicians, there was no one who could explain it to me. And that's the key point, of course, that there's no one to explain it to him, and that's why he's in front of Joseph here. And we won't look at it now, but Joseph is ready to go. I just want to note, as we get to verse 25, Joseph doesn't hesitate for one moment. Apparently, he's hearing this for the first time, and not only does he know the meaning of the dream, he knows exactly what to do in great detail. Was Joseph anticipating this in those 2 years he was in jail? Are we to infer that this is being given to him by God, even though the text doesn't actually say that God did it, except in the voice of Joseph that we'll hear? We as readers, like interpreters throughout the ages, have to decide that for ourselves. That's where we'll pick it up next time. See you then. Bye-bye.